Remember, the job of the president is to execute the laws of the United States, not to make his own laws, not to do his own thing. His job is to execute the laws of the United States as passed by Congress and signed by himself or other presidents. So he's got to execute the laws. Whatever the laws are, that's his job. Executive doesn't mean write the laws, it means execute the laws. So we group spending into three categories. So first, there's mandatory spending. Mandatory spending is not mandated by the Constitution, it's mandated by law. So Social Security, Medicare, federal retirement, those things are all written into law, and unless Congress changes the law, that money has to be spent. So if you're retired and you're in the Social Security system and you're getting a check, you are entitled to keep getting those checks until Congress changes the law. If you're getting Medicare, Medicaid, whatever it is, you are entitled to that until Congress changes the law. And that's why we call them entitlements. Now, in some sense, people in Social Security and Medicare say, look, I paid for these things. It's not that I'm entitled to them. I paid for them. So I already paid for them by working for 40 or 50 years. I get them. And so that's an interesting debate that we might have. Number two, interest on the national debt. Other than Social Security, interest on the national debt is the largest expense of the federal government. We have so much debt and we're paying so much interest on it that it's entitled to its own category. And then three, we have something called discretionary spending, and that's spending that's easily adjustable by Congress. So we can argue about the fact that technically all spending eventually is discretionary, but mandatory means it's in the law. People feel they're entitled to it. Discretionary spending is easily adjustable by Congress. So let's look at this. Here's all the spending. Fiscal year 2024, this is the last fiscal year that we completed. We spent $6.8 trillion and we took in $4.9 trillion. So if you do the math, we added last year $1.9 trillion to the national debt. Okay? That's a lot of freaking money. So $4.1 trillion of the $6.8 trillion is mandatory spending. That's Social Security, that's Medicare, that's Medicaid, that's those things. $1.8 trillion falls into what we call discretionary spending, and almost $1 trillion, $900 billion in interest. Now, let's be clear. We were $1.9 trillion over budget. We spent $1.9 trillion more than we had. If we had eliminated all discretionary spending, that wouldn't be enough of a spending cut to balance the budget. Would not. Okay? Would not. Now, let me just say, and again, we talked about this a little, we'll talk about it more, but there was a huge tax cut under Reagan, a huge tax cut under George W. Bush, and a huge tax cut under Trump, none of which were paid for. Those tax cuts are creating more than $1 trillion of that $1.9 trillion budget deficit. So if we just went back to the way taxes were in the 70s, we wouldn't hardly have a budget deficit. We wouldn't have much. We still have a budget deficit, but it would be less than half of what it is. Okay? People talk all the time about how great the economy was in the 1950s, 1960s. Well, the tax rate for millionaires during that time, and we talked about this, was 70-ish%. It's 28% now. That difference accounts for most, at least a good chunk of the budget deficit. People argue about it, but serious chunk of the budget deficit and a serious chunk of our national debt is those three huge budget cuts, or tax cuts rather, that went to rich people. I didn't get any money from the Reagan tax cut. I didn't get any money from the Bush tax cut. I didn't get any money from the Trump tax cut. In fact, my taxes went up under Trump. So, yeah. So discretionary spending, again, $1.8 trillion. Non-defense was $1 trillion. So if you're not willing to cut defense, total discretionary cuts you could make is only $1 trillion. Won't balance the budget. It's 6.3% of GDP, and the average, however, was 7.2%. So in the last 20 years, on average, the discretionary federal budget has been 7.2% of the, let's just say, total income of the country. So you look at the total of the whole country, we're spending, over the last 20 years, on average, we've spent 7.2% of that on discretionary federal spending. Last year, it was down to 6.3, which doesn't sound like a huge amount. It's still 1.8 trillion, but there has been a reining in of discretionary spending over the last 20 years. And we can look at this, and you can see that lately the problem, if you look at it, defense and non-defense kind of hung together for a long time. And since the pandemic, we've had a huge increase in the non-defense spending, which is caused by everything we did to deal with the pandemic, right? So the more we get past the pandemic, the more that problem should fix itself. Hopefully. Just saying. All right, so here's the defense part of spending. We spent $850 billion last year on defense. They're going to increase that to well over $900 billion for next year. 331 of that is operations and maintenance, $172 billion to pay everybody in the military, $152 billion to buy stuff. The military, if you really want to look at where the waste and fraud is, that is where you would start. That $152 million in military procurement, where they spend $7,000 on a toilet seat and nobody says anything about it, where the most expensive military procurement program in history is the F-35 fighter program. They had two possible companies they could give that contract to. So they gave each of the contractors, two contractors, a couple of $1 billion to build a prototype, and then they picked a prototype. One of those contractors couldn't even stay within their budget to create the prototype. And that's the one they gave the giant project to. Not the one who kept within the budget, but the one who blew up the budget during the prototype phase. So the amount of waste, and if you talk to anybody who's ever been in the military, they will just laugh at you about the waste and talk to you about the waste and give you story after story about the waste in the military. All right? Anyway, we had a crash between a helicopter and an airplane going into Washington. The helicopter was going up the Potomac. That's a route where VIPs, like congressmen and senators, use military helicopters for free to fly them somewhere. And so they use that route, which they won't be able to use anymore now that 90 people died. But think about the waste of all of the money. And again, not to pick on Trump, every weekend he's been president so far, he's gone to Mar-a-Lago to play golf. And it's about $2.5 million every weekend when he does that. So between going to the Super Bowl, going to the Daytona 500, and flying home to play golf, he's already spent $25 million. Right? And most of that money comes out of the military budget. Obama played golf a lot, but he played golf at the military bases in Washington. So he would just hop on his little helicopter, which again paid for by the military. He'd fly over to Andrews Air Force Base, where they have a couple of golf courses. He played golf over there, and then he'd come back to the White House. Okay? So Trump plays more golf than Obama did, but Obama intentionally didn't go very far. He played on military golf courses. Right? Play. $138 million in research development, and there's probably a bunch of waste in there, and then $57 billion of other, and who knows what's in there. So discretionary. Well, $134 billion in veterans benefits. Maybe you don't want to cut that. $130 billion in transportation. Transportation means we're paying for FAA. We're paying for air traffic control. We're paying for airports. We're paying for interstate highways. Education, training, a whole whopping $121 billion. Income security, $103 billion. Health, $100 billion. Administration of justice, that's the courts, $80 billion. International affairs, $78 billion. If you wipe out all the money we give to other countries, that's only $70 billion. And you say, well, that's a lot of money. But yeah, in the relative scheme of things, $78 billion is not that much. And we've been doing it mostly since the 60s, and mostly doing it to make friends. So you want people in Africa to like you. You build hospitals, you build schools, you work with those countries to help people get fresh water and hopefully they're your friends. Well, we don't want to make friends anymore. $56 billion natural resources and environment, $50 billion community and regional development. The whole budget, by the way, natural resources and environment, the whole budget for Yosemite National Park for the year is like $30 million. So we've already spent more on golf trips than on the entire budget for Yosemite, but they are cutting park rangers out of Yosemite to save money. Just makes no sense to me. And you can yell at me if you think I'm being bad here, but makes no sense to me. Community and regional development, giving money. I did some work for the county that the city of Henderson got a $5 million grant from the federal government for development, and that's all of the pipes and all the roads in the Valley Auto Mall was paid for by the federal government through a grant. Okay? And then science, space, technology, $41 billion, and then other. So, yeah. People say, I'll cut the space program. It's not that much money, and it generates a lot in return of new science and new stuff. So, deficits and debt. So, see this box right here? The annual deficit, amount by which outlays exceed revenue. So the deficit means this year. So when I say we had a $1.9 trillion deficit last year, that means just last year we spent $1.9 trillion more than we took in. The debt is the sum of all the deficits over time. Okay? The last time the United States didn't have a debt, Andrew Jackson was president, 1836. Okay? Andrew Jackson left office without a national debt. Every president since has left office with a national debt. The last president to not have a budget deficit when he left office again was Bill Clinton, and that lasted a year. So the deficit last year was 6.4% of GDP. That's pretty high. The average deficit in the last 50 years has only been 3.8, and I say only 3.8. It's still kind of high, but only 3.8. The deficit. The public holds 98%. Let's say you're going to go buy a house. And again, we need to talk about this in more depth. But you want to go buy a house. How much of a house you can buy is dependent on what your income is. Right? How much debt you can have as a person. The banks base that on how much income you have. So how much debt we have as a country needs to balance out how much income we have. So the debt held by the public at the end of 2024 is 98% of GDP. Okay? So our debt is roughly the size of our GDP. It's held by the public. Now, a quarter of the national debt is held by the Federal Reserve. And so the government owes a quarter of its own debt to itself, which is kind of a funny arrangement. On average, over the past 50 years, that's only been 50%. So it's been going up. And you can see on this graph, you can see here on the graph that we go back into the 70s and 80s, we have a little bit of budget deficit. Then Clinton not only balances the budget, but gets us to the good side, where we're actually starting to pay off the national debt, right? And then Bush, and then we have a recession, right? We have the 2008, 9, 10 recession, and then Obama brings it back down, and then, oops. Yeah, that was a oops, don't worry about that. Obama starts bringing it back down again, and then we get Trump and the pandemic, and then Biden starts bringing it back down, but then his last 2 years in office, it starts going back up again. Okay?